Hello, I'm Maria Titizian.
And I'm Rubina Margosian, and this is the Week in Review.
Every week, we bring you the stories shaping Armenia and the region.
From politics and policy to social issues and conflict, we break down the news and what it means for you.
This week in the news, the EU approves a €20 million military aid package under the European Peace Facility. The National Security Service releases document alleging Archbishop Ezras Nersisyan, the Catholicos' brother, collaborated with the Soviet KGB in the late 1980s. And Azerbaijani gasoline reaches Armenia for the first time via the Azerbaijan-Georgia-Armenia rail route. These stories and more in our weekly roundup of the news.
Armenia is set to receive a €20 million military aid package under the European Peace Facility. The Foreign Ministry said there is now a political agreement to move the process forward. Media reports say Hungary has lifted its veto on the package, which was first proposed back in March. The assistance is expected to be formally approved in January. Once finalized, it will mark the second time the EU has approved military assistance to Armenia, following a €10 million package approved in July of 2024.
Meanwhile, Armenia has requested European Union assistance to counter foreign interference ahead of the 2026 parliamentary elections. The EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, said that with the upcoming parliamentary elections next year, Armenia had asked for similar help from the EU to, quote, fight the malign foreign influence like the EU had granted to Moldova. The Czech permanent representation to the EU explicitly noted and mentioned Russia, which it said will seek to influence the upcoming parliamentary elections in Armenia. Now, Kallas didn't mention Russia, that's why we're pointing this out. Armenia's Deputy Parliament Speaker Rupen Rubinian told reporters that ongoing disinformation campaigns are evidence of possible external meddling. The threats are well known. There are manifestations in Armenia's domestic political arena that can be interpreted as attempts at interference, he said. Rubinian emphasized that the government is expanding its tools to prevent any form of external intervention. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov commented on Kallas's remarks, calling it a full-blown confession and a formal admission of guilt of what he called an open intervention by the EU in Armenian elections.
In Brussels, Armenian Foreign Minister Archbishop Nersisyan joined EU foreign ministers for an informal working breakfast meeting on December 15, highlighting the deepening ties between Armenia and the EU just weeks after the adoption of a new strategic agenda between the sides. EU members voiced strong support for Armenia's democratic development, efforts to enhance resilience, and measures to counter hybrid threats, including disinformation and foreign interference ahead of the country's upcoming parliamentary elections in 2026. Nersisyan said they also assessed the progress in the visa liberalization process, something he described as very important for Armenian citizens and in terms of bringing Armenia closer to the European Union.
In the meantime, Armenia signed another strategic partnership document, this time with Luxembourg. Foreign Affairs Minister Arat Mirzoyan visited the country after he was in Brussels for that meeting that we just talked about, and met with his counterpart Xavier Bettel. The two reaffirmed the high level of political dialogue between their countries and signed a declaration on a strategic partnership. This follows a similar document Armenia signed with Germany a week earlier and the EU strategic partnership agenda a week before that.
On the military front, Armenia signed annual defense programs with European partners, France and Greece, for 2026. The NATO Deputy Secretary General Radmila Shekerinska visited Armenia this week and held meetings with Prime Minister Pashinyan and Defense Minister Surem Papikyan. Shekerinska emphasized NATO's significant role in the ongoing defense reforms and the transformation of the armed forces.
And Armenia's Security Council Secretary Armen Grigoryan traveled to London this week for meetings with senior British officials, including head of the Secret Intelligence Service, commonly known as MI6, UK Minister of State for Defense and UK Minister of State for Europe, discussing cooperation in respective areas. Grigoryan and Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor to the British Prime Minister, reaffirmed their mutual readiness to elevate bilateral ties to the level of a strategic partnership as agreed upon back in August.
And this week, senior U.S. and Armenian officials held held the inaugural meeting of a bilateral working group to begin implementing the Memoranda of Understanding signed in Washington on August 8. Discussions focused on joint projects of strengthening energy security, semiconductor supply chains, and AI development, as well as Armenia's transportation infrastructure and border security. The U.S. Embassy said Washington looks forward to working with our valuable strategic partner, Armenia, to advance President Trump's vision for peace and prosperity in the South Caucasus. Meanwhile, Russia signaled interest in the U.S.-Armenia TRIP initiative. A Russian foreign ministry official said Moscow is ready to consult with Armenian officials on the project's parameters and possible Russian participation. Speaking to state media, Mikhail Galuzhin, who oversees the South Caucasus portfolio, cited Russia's management of Armenia's railways, the use of Russian rail gauge, and the presence of Russian border guards, adding that Armenia's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union makes Russian involvement obvious. Armenian officials pushed back. Deputy Parliament Speaker Ruben Rubinian said there are no discussions on Russia's involvement in TRIP. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan separately said Armenia has asked Russia to urgently restore key railway sections linking Yerevan to Nakhichevan and Akhurian to the Turkish border. On TRIP specifically, Pashinyan stressed that any discussion of third country involvement can only take place in a bilateral format between Armenia and the United States, calling it an Armenian-American project.
Iran has warned that the U.S.-Armenia TRIP initiative poses security risks, with Ali Akbar Velayati, a senior advisor to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, telling Armenia's ambassador to Tehran that the project is effectively the same as the Zangezur corridor, which Iran firmly opposes. Velayati argued that such a corridor could enable a NATO presence north of Iran, threatening Iran's security and that of southern Russia. Armenia rejected the comparison. Ambassador Grigor Hagopian told Velayati that TRIP will be implemented strictly on the principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, jurisdiction, and reciprocity, and is aimed at regional connectivity and economic development. He added that Yerevan values Iran's stated support for these principles and takes Tehran's security sensitivities into account. Deputy Parliament Speaker Ruben Rubinian also dismissed claims that TRIP resembles the so-called Zangezur corridor, stressing that Armenia will not allow any extraterritorial corridor through its territory. He said Armenia's red lines align closely with Iran's and noted that Iran's foreign ministry has repeatedly stated there is no corridor issue involved. It's important to note that analysts say that the remarks reflect internal differences in Tehran. Iran's president and foreign minister have previously taken a more measured tone on TRIP, while hardliners have openly criticized the initiative.
And in more regional news, President Erdogan said Turkey may take some symbolic steps towards normalization with Armenia starting from the beginning of next year. In a speech to Turkish ambassadors, Erdogan said that Azerbaijan and Armenia are closer than ever to signing a peace agreement. Parallel to this process, we are advancing our normalization processes with Armenia in dialogue with Azerbaijan, he said.
On December 19, 1,300 tons of Azerbaijani gasoline arrived in Armenia for the first time via the Azerbaijan-Georgia-Armenia rail route. The agreement was reached on November 28 during a meeting between the deputy prime ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia's economy minister, Kevork Baboyan, stated that this is likely the first trade and economic transaction between Armenia and Azerbaijan, not only since peace was established between the two countries, but more broadly since independence. Earlier in the month, Georgia had announced it would waive transit fees for the first shipment of Azerbaijani petroleum products to Armenia. Baboyan also said additional wheat shipments are in transit but declined to specify their countries of origin, adding that details will be published once the wheat arrives. And last month, Armenia and Azerbaijan mutually lifted transit restrictions through each other's territory. Since then, wheat shipments from Russia and Kazakhstan have reached Armenia via Azerbaijan.
And about the ongoing standoff between Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's government and the Catholicos of all Armenians, Gagarin II. On December 19, opposing sides gathered at the Mother See of Holy Echmiadzin amid renewed calls for the Catholicos' resignation. 10 archbishops who had last week demanded Gagarin II step down issued a new appeal this week, calling his resignation an urgent necessity and accusing him of years of unilateral, arbitrary, and non-canonical communal governance. They warned that the current course of the Armenian Apostolic Church threatens both church and national interests. The archbishops called on clergy and believers together at Echmiadzin, prompting parallel rallies. Supporters of the Catholicos, including opposition figures like Seyran Ohanyan and Ishkhan Sagatarian, gathered near his residence, while supporters of the resignation demand assembled nearby. Police separated the two groups. The Union of Informed Citizens estimated about 2,200 pro-Catholicos supporters and roughly 1,020 demonstrators backing his resignation. It sounds like I'm commenting on a football match. Well,
it kind of was.
Garegin II entered the Mother Cathedral to lead a prayer service, while the 10 archbishops gathered separately at St. Gayane Monastery nearby. They later announced they had formally submitted a written resignation demand to the Mother See. The Mother See condemned the calls, warning they risk public unrest and deepen divisions within the church. It accused the archbishops of advancing a false agenda and exploiting believers' religious sentiments. Tensions escalated further after the Mother See convened the Supreme Spiritual Council, finally, because this has been planned and then postponed for a while. The archbishops rejected the meeting's legitimacy, saying the council has operated in violation of church statutes since 2021 and calling for its suspension and the convening of a new ecclesiastical a new assembly, convening of a new ecclesiastical representative assembly, and calling for its suspension and the convening of a new ecclesiastical and calling for a new ecclesiastical representative assembly. The Mother See defended the council's composition, citing statutory provisions and practical constraints.
Speaking at a government briefing, Prime Minister Pashinyan denied orchestrating the actions of the 10 archbishops, calling for the resignation of the Catholicos, saying he does not instruct them but openly supports their stance. Pashinyan said his alignment with the bishops is limited to what he described as a shared goal of renewing the Armenian church, which he argued cannot happen without removing Ezras Nersisyan, who is the Catholicos and who the Prime Minister refuses to call the Catholicos.
And
he calls
most
them by
government
his birth name.
members.
Yeah, without removing Ezras Nersisyan from the Mother See.
Well, a news that just broke right before we started recording this podcast, Armenia's National Security Service says Archbishop Ezras Nersisyan, head of the Diocese of Russia and New Nakhichevan and the brother of the Catholicos, cooperated with the Soviet KGB between 1986 and 1988 under the codename Garo. The information was published by the government-affiliated outlet Civic AM, which cited a response from the NSS and released a declassified document allegedly confirming the cooperation. The National Security Service also said that Archbishop Nersisyan is currently maintaining contacts with representatives of foreign intelligence services, which may pose a threat to Armenia's security and national interests. The NSS said it is taking measures within its legal authority to neutralize the identified risks. Pashinyan had also addressed allegations of foreign intelligence ties priorly, citing publicly available documents that claim the Catholicos' brother served as a KGB agent during the Soviet period. Pashinyan said the information is known to state bodies, but stressed that KGB affiliation does not constitute grounds for criminal prosecution, as they were Soviet citizens at the time. He added that claims of cooperation with foreign special services involve legal and political complexities, including sensitivities related to interstate relations, and cannot be reduced to straightforward criminal cases.
Well, in other news, we've been talking about the church forever. Armenia's parliament approved a major healthcare reform introducing universal healthcare insurance starting in just a few weeks in January of 2026. The first phase will cover children, seniors, people with disabilities, vulnerable groups, and some employees, with the state subsidizing most costs. By 2029, the government plans to extend coverage to all citizens and residents, with services available at public and private healthcare facilities, and details to be published online. And we have an extensive article coming up at the beginning of the year that outlines and explains everything about how much we actually have to end up paying from our own salaries.
We're starting this month already.
Yeah.
Next
month,
well,
yeah.
Parliament also adopted a bill reducing the duration of compulsory military service from 2 years to a year and a half, 18 months. The law will take effect on January 1st, 2026, and will not apply to those already serving at that time. The bill passed with 65 votes in favor, 4 against, and 20 abstentions.
And in the ongoing trial in Baku, prosecutors have requested a sentence of life in prison for Ruben Vartanyan. Vartanyan has said he expects to deliver a closing statement in the coming days. In remarks related to his family, he stated that he does not recognize the proceedings as a legitimate judicial process and does not intend to participate in what he described as an imitation of justice, arguing that the trial fails to meet basic standards of a fair hearing. The developments come as Azerbaijan's parliament adopted an amnesty resolution in a first reading following an initiative, or a directive, I suppose, by President Ilham Aliyev. The amnesty would apply to a wide range of categories, including participants in Azerbaijan's military operations, veterans, people convicted of minor or non-violent offenses, women, minors, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Those convicted of grave or especially grave crimes are explicitly excluded. In Armenia, the amnesty has prompted speculation that it could potentially apply to some Armenians imprisoned in Azerbaijan, though no official confirmation has been given and Azerbaijani authorities have not addressed that possibility. Now, in this context, Viken Ölcekyan's lawyer, Luciana Minasyan, Viken Ölcekyan is a Lebanese Armenian who was taken on November 10, I believe, of 2020. His wife, Linda Ölcekyan, submitted a letter to Azerbaijan's first vice president and wife of
spouse,
Mehriban Aliyeva, in August, raising humanitarian concerns similar to those outlined in the newly announced amnesty initiative. Minasyan, the lawyer, said no official response was received, but noted that the president's statement aligns with what the family had been expecting. In the letter, Linda Ölcekyan appealed for clemency on humanitarian grounds, citing her husband's prolonged imprisonment, the death of his mother while he was incarcerated, and the terminal illness of another close family member. She called for mercy rather than political consideration.
A court has extended the detention of Vartan Ghukasyan, the temporarily suspended Gyumri mayor, by 3 months. Ghukasyan's defense team had requested that his detention be replaced by an alternative preventive measure. Lawmakers from the opposition Armenia faction, Geran Manukyan, Garnik Danielyan, and Meher Melkonyan, also offered personal guarantees in support of that request. The court rejected the motions.
And this week, 7 properties with a combined market-adjusted value of more than 2 billion Armenian dirhams, that's about $6 million US, were transferred to the state. The move is part of the Armenian government's ongoing efforts to confiscate property deemed to be of illegal origin, much of it allegedly appropriated before 2018. Among the properties transferred is a plot in Zargatsor valued at close to $1 million, which had belonged to businessman Samvel Mayrabedyan, who is linked to former President Robert Kocharian and is the subject of several ongoing cases, including investigations related to property appropriation and tax evasion. So, interesting week, interesting times ahead, for sure. And as always, we talk about the articles that we published this week. The first is by Sositatikyan. The United States just recently published their new national security strategy, and Sosi has done quite a deep dive to see what the implications for Armenia are. So the piece is called The New U.S. National Security Strategy, Implications for Armenia. And she says that this strategy signals a shift towards sovereignty-centered transactional realism. Anyway, it's a typical Sosi Tatikyan article where she doesn't leave any stone unturned.
True. And another article we published this week, Armenia's Hate Speech Blind Spot by Anush Bekoyan. The arrest of two Armenian podcasters has reignited debate over where free expression ends and criminal liability begins. Well, the article exposes Armenia's unresolved legal blind spot in addressing sexualized gendered abuse without undermining democratic speech.
And an interesting thing that it's interesting for me anyway, I think so too. It's called AI, drones, blockchain, and agriculture. Young Armenian entrepreneurs are bringing AI, drones, and blockchain into agriculture these days in Armenia. They're developing tools specifically tailored to small-scale farmers. These include smart beehives to precision spraying and traceable wool. These agri-tech startups are really reshaping rural livelihoods while navigating a small and cautious market, because it was interesting how some of these small farms, they don't want to spend the money on these AI technology or the sort of the drone spraying their crops, but they don't realize that oftentimes that efficiency will help improve their production. Anyway, it was an interesting piece by Catherine Odom.
And the piece that
I love.
And touched a lot of people, especially women.
Yes.
And a lot of us related to it because it's kind of like, I was thinking my future. It's by Ani Gilosian, Aging, Dignity, and the Armenian Woman. And she speaks about how aging in Armenia is not just a matter of years, but of dignity and belonging. She examines the lived experiences of older women, reveals how health programs, social neglect, and cultural expectations shape well-being, belonging, and ultimately the right to be seen in later life. And she's basically saying, especially as women age, there's so much expectation from them to keep the household going, to take care of grandchildren, but at the same time,
keepers of memory.
They're absolutely even more neglected with age,
and they're exhausted.
And how there aren't enough programs.
The space around them shrinks. So I think that's why it resonated with a lot of people, I think, and I'm really proud to be able to bring these stories to the public discourse, because between church state, between elections, Russian interference, Azerbaijan's ongoing rhetoric, we forget
we are going to get old.
We are. Indeed. And a piece that we published today by a new first-time contributor, Andrei Torosyan. It's called Venice 2015, 10 Years On, Creative Resistance and Contemporary Crises. When he submitted the article, I thought, this was a biennale that took place 10 years ago on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. Why are we talking about it again? But he really revisits it, reading it through today's post-2020 realities, the war, displacement, the loss of Artsakh, and he asks who speaks for Armenians, how identity relates to territory, and what forms of Armenity, how you tune, can endure. So it was a lovely piece.
Yes, this is a much talked about subject today in the art space, in the creative space, because artists are becoming a little bit more political sometimes recently, luckily maybe, because I sometimes feel that the art space in Armenia isn't involved enough in current affairs.
Rubina, we've also published pieces. Sometimes they do talk about the things that are sometimes you don't want to talk about, and they push boundaries, and they are really well positioned to do that. So I do hope they continue, because everybody else, as I said, is busy either getting old or talking about
trip and shipments from Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
Well, this actually ties nicely with the podcast I did this week with Sona Tatoyan. She's a storyteller, actress, producer, and the story is that she found
very cool.
180 of her great-grandfather's shadow puppets in an attic in Aleppo, and she gets a little, there's a little mystique around it, and how she broke her leg and couldn't leave, so she was
stuck with
the puppets during the war. In their old house, abandoned house, trying to heal and kind of sitting with the story, which eventually turned into a multimedia performance that's still playing, I think, with small breaks. Hopefully we'll see it as well, but she does take a new kind of license with this inherited puppets that
How come we don't have interesting stories like this? I don't know. My great-grandfather having puppets in an attic somewhere.
Maybe some stories should be left in the closet and the attic.
Yeah, maybe. Well, that's the kind of week it's been here in Armenia. Thank you for listening. Have a safe and peaceful weekend, and we will be back again next week. It will be our last podcast of the year.